Hi, everyone.
Hello, everybody.
Today we thought we would do something a little different and do a porch talk. So as we've been going around the property and looking at different buildings, kind of exploring, researching, cleaning out, we've obviously had a lot of questions from you all, but it's also raised a lot of questions for us. So we thought it would be good to talk through the history of the previous owner, the property, what we've learned, what we know so far, what we've been able to dig up, and also let you know that there's still a lot of things we haven't been able to solve or find. So we'll start with the most recent owner. We purchased the property a little over a year ago, and unfortunately it was an estate. He had passed away.
Yeah, he passed away like 4 or 5 months prior to us purchasing this, right?
He didn't have any local family, no children, wife, anything like that. He was an individual that lived here by himself, and his family came from out of state and cleaned up the 1930s house a little bit, but the rest of the property they pretty much left as we've been discovering it. So I think that he had owned the property for about 20 years prior to us.
Yeah, the county records indicate he bought it like 2001 or 2002 or 2003. I can't remember the exact date, but it was early 2000.
We were able to quickly learn that he was a lover of languages, books, knowledge, and an avid collector of many different things. And as we started asking around the different neighbors, we learned pretty quickly that a lot of the neighbors have been transplants also, similar to us, coming from out of state, other areas, and have only lived here for the last 10 or so years. Didn't have a whole lot of history, and didn't have, just had a few stories about the previous owner, but not a lot. So a lot of the things that we found out was as we were cleaning out the house. Since he was such a great note taker and just collector of things, as we were cleaning things out, we found a lot of notes, a lot of receipts that kind of helped us deduce when this 1930s house was built onto. The original house itself is just the large library area, the kitchen, and the one bedroom. That's the original 1930s house with the original roof line, and when you start taking away the drywall, you can see it's the original build. The 2 bathrooms and now the 2 bedrooms that are farther back, once you pass through the kitchen, that was all added on by the previous owner. And so we were able to kind of figure that out with some receipts and some timelines, and also writings on the boards, as like on the doorways in the build and things like that.
Yeah, the remodel and the addition of the house in about 2007, 2008, 2009 time frame, so it's just a few years after he purchased the house. The 1930s house was farther back on the property, and we think it was moved. Actually, do we know when it was moved?
I don't know that we know when it was moved, but we thought it was moved because of the ability to get city water.
If I look at old aerial images, old images show pictures of where the house used to be back on the property and a driveway that actually went through several of our neighbor properties. The property that we're on used to encompass many of the properties around us, so it had been divided over the years. In fact, when the previous owner purchased it in early 2000s, they purchased it from the neighbors to our east. The neighbors had 120 acres and they split it down to divide it. Unfortunately, they passed away before Katie and I had the opportunity to speak with them. What we do know, in addition to the 1930s house being farther back on the property, is that this property was actually originally purchased from, I think it was called the Holston expansion, I think. It's a larger area within East Tennessee. Back in 1796. So 500 acres were purchased, and over the years, obviously it's been split off. But 500 acres were purchased from a gentleman and his family after they had left the Revolutionary War, which is so crazy to think that when this property was purchased, the whole area that we're in wasn't even Tennessee. The Holston Territories, I think it's called. But the 500 acres was actually part of North Carolina, and then eventually split off and became Tennessee 5 years after they purchased this property. So I might be off a little bit with my dates, but it was 1790 something that they purchased it, and then it became part of Tennessee. The original purchaser, the senior, he died about 10 years after purchasing this property, and then willed it down to his 5 or 6 kids that he had. 2 of which, the 2 older boys, received the majority of the 500 acres. In that time, they converted basically, it was raw land, just forest, into a working homestead. They constructed a home on the property, and it was a brick home, which was new type construction for that era. And there are court records showing that in 1800, the eldest boy filed for a permit. He needed permits back then too, to build the grain mill that we have evidence of on the creek, and got approved by the courts. And so the grain mill was built in 1800, operated until 1920, and then was torn down in 1930. The reason that the grain mill was torn down in 1930 is because the owner at that time, they had purchased a bunch of land in their area, and they already had a grain mill, an operating, fully functional, really good condition grain mill just up the river, and they didn't need to have 2. And her husband, who had been running both grain mills and maintaining them, died, and she just didn't have the resources to continue with both. So she had our grain mill decommissioned. We know this because we've talked to one of the descendants of the original owner of this property, 8th generation. There isn't a lot of information available in the county because early on in this county, where all the records for land ownership were kept, there was a fire and it destroyed all the records, and there wasn't a way for archival, and they didn't have copies back then. It wasn't digital. So all of that history has been lost. So most of the stuff that we're finding out is from stories from people that lived in the area for a long time. One of the stories is the original owner, the senior, that after the Revolutionary War, when he died, they buried they put his grave where our creek and the river meet. And there was a giant flood on the river in early 1900, like 1901, and that made the river rise like 26 feet.
That'd be crazy.
I mean, it's a huge amount. Luckily, our property, we're about, I think we're like 75 feet above the river level. So there wasn't any chance of it flooding up here, but the river raised 26 feet. It washed out the grave site, and it was about a year later, or 2 years later, that some local boys, so this was again 1901, so 123 years ago, some local boys, some teenagers, found the gravestone and I guess some bones, some remains, and they knew that it belonged to him. And they took those bones and they put it into a wooden box on the second floor of the grain mill that was still standing, still operational, still standing. And when we talked to the 8th generation family member, their story was that those teenage boys, as they grew up over the years, every few years they would go down to the grain mill, explore and have fun, and they would look in the box, and the bones would slowly be disintegrating until their last story is that they opened the box and the bones were just dust. And this was before it got torn down. So that's kind of where the story ends. Like, there's not anything more available because, again, you know, the courthouse burnt, or the records were burned in a fire. So we know that this property was originally in North Carolina, turned Tennessee, was 500 acres, and now is down to 60. And so all the property around us. So one of the fun stories, I don't know if we've ever told this story, but it was kind of fun. So we know that the 500 acres encompassed the creek that we're on, and then it went down to the river. And it encompassed the start of the creek and the end of the creek. Right now we're at the end of the creek. The last, 1,000 feet, 1,500 feet of the creek?
Yeah.
The original brick house was up at the top of the creek, where the creek started from a spring in the ground. And so that was their water source, was the spring. Katie was on Facebook Marketplace, and a chair or porch swing caught her attention. And she thought, oh, it'd be fun. In fact, it's to her right.
Yep.
She thought it'd be fun to have a porch swing for the porch here. So she contacted the seller, and we ended up heading over there, only to find out that it was like 2 miles away, 2 miles on road.
Yeah.
But if we were to walk there, it was probably a mile.
Yeah.
And we were sitting there chatting with the owners. Of course, they were transplants too. And we had mentioned that we were at the end of a creek. And they're like, we're at the beginning of that creek. In fact, it's right behind you. We're like, what in the world? So we were able to go and head to the start of the creek, where it's coming out of the ground, where there's a well house, and see the beginning of the creek. It was like, what are the chances? Yeah,
that it was a spring-fed creek. We didn't know it was a spring-fed creek, or we didn't really know much about it or where it came off of. And so just right over the hill, basically, is where it starts.
Yeah.
And it goes through a couple properties before it gets to us. And their creek is only about this wide on their property. And then when it gets to our property, it's over 6 feet wide. So very interesting just how as it traverses through.
I had hoped to find more information about the mill itself, pictures, more history about it, but we're finding there isn't. And the 8th generation family member, they've done a lot of digging over the years, talked to a lot of local people, and they've gathered the information, most of the information that is available. So we kind of feel that is not really worth it wouldn't be an endeavor that we want to take on, because it's just so much work to do, and I think they've really covered the majority of it. And since there isn't any court records to kind of fall back on, I think we kind of have what we have.
Yeah. So we feel like we know close to what we will know about this property. And Nate has done a lot of sleuthing and digging. He likes to go down and start just checking and going through the history of stuff. He really enjoys that. So we've spent lots of time trying to get some more history on the property, but we just don't think, unfortunately, there's a lot more that we're going to be able to find.
Yeah, I mean, we do know a few things vaguely. We know that, it was a farm. It was farmed for, we definitely assume, tobacco. Just given the fact that there's 3 or 2 barns that are set up, actually 3.
For tobacco,
set up for tobacco. We don't know when the barns were built, but we're kind of assuming that it was in the 1950s, just based on some of the neighboring properties. They have barns, and they were built about in the same time period. A little different style, but kind of similar. We don't know much about the 1970s house. We don't know who lived there, what they used it for, but I'm assuming because it was the previous owner to us, that it was part of the 120 acres to our east. With aerial images, the farthest that I can go back, I think, was 1950. The barns, there's indications by picture that the barns were there, and that this house was, in fact, actually, that's what I remember. This house in the 1950s was back there on the site, but then the next one that jumps to like 1983, it's up here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do remember that. every once in a while we run into something little new nugget, but
Yeah.
you know, we've shared everything with you so far.
We were hoping when we cleaned up this house that we would come across like scrapbooks or picture books, because he was so diligent in recording things and saving. We were hopeful that we would find pictures of the property, at least when he purchased it, because the last 20 years you can just see the trees getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and less pasture. And so definitely once he purchased it, he didn't do any farming or anything like that. So we know that the overgrowth has been within the last 20 years that we're trying to reclaim and get back. But perhaps when we clean out the other house that he didn't live in, that he just used for storage, maybe we'll be able to find some because there was a whole bookcase of scrapbooks. So maybe we'll be able to find some old pictures. That's what we're really hoping, is we can come across some actual photographs or a listing of the property or something like that. I think that'd be really cool.
Like when we had Justin on the property, we learned about some of the uses for the barns. You know, we didn't even know that the dam was there where we constantly go to at the creek. And he's like, "What's that dam doing there?"
We're like, "Wait, what?"
You know, so we learn. You know, over time we'll probably have more people that have long history come out to the property and just explore with us and kind of give us some insight information about various things. So so that's kind of what we know.
Yeah. So thought we'd share it with you, and just because we do get a ton of questions and people want us to go back and research, and just wanted to share that we just hadn't really talked too much about it. So thought we would do that today.
Yeah, I had hoped to have a lot more information to be able to share. That's why we haven't really shared what we've known so far, but we're just kind of running into dead ends.
Yeah. So, well, hope you found this informative or at least interesting.
Yeah.
And we'll, I guess, see you on the next one.
Yep. We'll see you tomorrow.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.